Hey everyone, it's Allie, and let's talk about a pretty big update to our mana stacking Stormweaver build. Due to quite a few reasons stacking on top of each other, such as the game being pretty overtuned, crafting not really being accessible in the early game like we were led to believe, and GG completely gutting all defensive layers at the top of the passive tree, we kind of have to go this really overpowered cold build to make it through the axe and get into the endgame, at which point we can get the gear needed to be able to play Archmage properly. I did try to swap to Archmage yesterday, and while it worked well, we just kind of ran into the issue of if you don't have a way to permanently CC everything on the screen, you kind of have a miserable time. Currently, personally, I feel like most white monsters are substantially more difficult than pretty much every single boss in the game. And while we do have some ways to get around this and pretty much permanently CC everything with a spark setup on Archmage, for now, that is a little bit inaccessible. So I'd rather tell everyone to play this cold setup that we came up with that feels unbelievably good and pretty much melts every boss and every pack that you come across until we can put together all the gear that we need for the Archmage swap. Archmage will always be the better endgame build in comparison to this, simply due to the fact that this build kind of runs out of scaling pretty quickly as there really isn't anywhere to take the build. The other issue with it as well is that while this build can freeze everything on the screen, it absolutely guzzles our mana, meaning that we can never possibly go Mind Over Matter with it, meaning we don't really have any defensive layers on this if we don't manage to freeze something. With that said, I feel like this is going to be by far the best way for everyone to get into endgame and be able to swap to Archmage. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how to put it together, how to swap to it, and what makes this so good. This whole build is going to be centered around one very specific thing, and that is going to be Cast on Freeze Comet. Cast on Freeze is by far the most broken of all the casts, given that it gives you 100 energy every time you freeze. Freezing something is meant to be very difficult, but as we've learned, CCing enemies, and especially freezing bosses, realistically isn't that difficult, allowing us to massively abuse this skill gem. We are then running a comet with it, which is the hardest hitting skill in the game, and well, this allows us to spam quite a lot of comets on everything, including bosses, giving us some pretty solid DPS. To be able to swap to this, you're going to need 4 things. First, you're going to have to get yourself a new weapon, and this weapon doesn't really have to be anything special. Just take whatever you had on your current weapon and replace the word lightning with cold. For example, my weapon just has +4 to all cold spell skills on it. It is horrible, but this has been more than enough for me to be able to go and delete everything towards the end game. At a bare minimum, if you can get yourself a weapon with +2 to +3 cold spell skills and just literally anything remotely useful on it, you will have a pretty good time. Second, you are going to have to get yourself a Cast on Freeze, which if you didn't take from the Bog Witch in Act 3, that's completely okay, as you get plenty of Spirit Gems as you keep going through Act 3, and we have to wait towards the end of it anyways, as we're going to need a Comet to be able to realistically get this going. You can play this with Cold Snap, for example, but personally, I don't really like it, and it feels a little bit clunky, and I prefer to just tell people to stick with the lightning build until you get Comet and Cast on Freeze. Finally, as the 4th item, you are going to need to get yourself somewhere around 35 to 40,000 gold to be able to respec all the passive points on the tree over to the proper setup. This is pretty easy to do if you don't have any gold, as you can simply just go and pick up a bunch of blue and yellow gear off the ground, identify them, and then sell them to the vendor instead of disenchanting them. And it shouldn't take you more than 2 to 3 zones to farm the gold. Honestly, it's probably going to take you longer to find a cold weapon than it is to get the gold required for the respec if you do not have the money for the respec in the first place. Once you have all that put together, the setup is going to be fairly simple. In the description, there will be a link for both a skill tree planner that is going to show you what your passive tree should look like to begin with, as well as all of the gems and all the links so you can view all of it in one place. If you want to go into a little bit more detail about the basic setup, basically all we're doing is just removing the nodes at the start as well as swapping the pathing over to cold, and then coming over here and getting ourselves climate change and getting all the cold nodes up here. Please ignore the fact that I have all of these green lightning nodes still allocated on my tree, as I was doing some testing with weapon swapping, and that is why I have both. But you're simply coming up here to get all of these cold nodes, and then we're going to be pathing over to the right, and we're going to be picking up this energized node. We do not need these 3 nodes leading up to energize, as these do not do anything for our build. There's going to be a very specific breakpoint for Cast on Freeze that I need to mention and that you need to be aware of, as it is going to massively boost the total power of your build if you do set it up properly. Cast on Freeze gives you 100 energy every time you freeze an enemy. Because of Comet's cast time, that 100 energy is not enough to trigger a Comet as soon as you freeze something, and you would have to do 2 freezes to be able to trigger it. We want to only have to do 1 freeze to be able to trigger the Comet, so as our first support that we are linking to our Cast on Freeze and the Comet is going to be Impetus for 40% increased energy gain, and we then have to pick up this 8% meta skill gem energy increase to then get enough energy every time you freeze to trigger a comet every time. There's no overflow on energy, so picking up these 3 additional nodes is completely pointless, and there would just be a waste of passive points. As long as you keep that in mind, you will have a great time with Cast on Freeze and should have no issue clearing pretty much everything. Once you do come over here and pick this up, what I did was then go over to the left and get myself the Touch of the Arcane node as well as the 3 elemental nodes over here. And after that, I simply just went and got myself more mana regeneration over here. And I've been slowly working on my way over to Arcane Intensity to just pick up even more mana regeneration from there. Our goal with the rest of the tree is just keep picking up mana regen after mana regen, as it's just going to make it so our build deals with the ever-increasing cost of a comet more easily. And what I wanted to do today on stream was test stacking enough mana to potentially go Eldritch Battery and Mind Over Matter with the setup so we can have a proper defensive layer. What you could possibly also do is come over to the right and pick up Heavy Frost and Thin Ice to get more freeze buildup, allowing you to do more damage to bosses, or to potentially come over to Shattered Crystal and pick the Reduced Ice Crystal Life to get you even more single target DPS on top of that. If we want to talk about the skill setup that we're going to be running with this build is going to consist of 2 things. First, you're going to have your main skill that you're going to be spamming to trigger your Cast on Freeze, and then you're going to have a bunch of auxiliary buffs and ways of being able to generate more damage if you need so on rares and uniques. You're going to be running a Frostbolt setup first, and it's going to carry you over until you can get yourself an Eye Winter, as in my opinion, Eye Winter just feels substantially better to clear with. And then you're simply just going to move your Arcane Tempo over from your Frostbolt to your Eye Winter, and then add a Pierce, and then completely drop the Frostbolt as soon as you can. And then this should pretty much clear everything for you, as you'll trigger a bunch of comets everywhere, and every pack should just immediately die. For rares and uniques that might not necessarily die in a single freeze, we have a few things that can help us do more damage. First, we have Frostbomb, which is going to give us exposure, so we gain extra DPS, while at the same time doing a reasonable amount of damage on its own, giving us a easier way to freeze bosses. And then we're gonna have Cold Snap, which we can use as a massive nuke every time a monster is actually frozen to basically guarantee that they die. And then finally, we have Frostball, which is the silliest skill in the game, is going to be the majority of our DPS on bosses. Frostball puts down a bunch of walls everywhere. If they get damaged hard enough, they will then explode to do cold damage. On some bosses, their hitbox is actually so large that if you put the Frostball right on top of them, they will immediately destroy it just due to the size of their hitbox and immediately take the damage from it. This means that on a boss, all you really have to do is just keep pressing Frostball on cooldown, keep spamming Frostballs on cooldown on top of the boss, and then just spam your Eye Winter or your Frostbolt until the enemy is frozen, and then just immediately press a Cold Snap and watch your comets come down on top of the boss and chunk it for a large portion of its health. It's very simple and very to the point, and it's a really, really fun setup. And if you want to include more here to do even more damage, you can also potentially even press a Hypothermia on a boss to gain more DPS, or even get yourself a Sigil Power Staff like we were using in the previous day and put down the Sigil Power before doing all of your other abilities to gain even more free damage. The playstyle is very simple and very to the point, and in my opinion has actually been pretty fun because it kind of gives you a lot of options on how to deal with a boss, between putting Frostballs down either on top of them or in front of them so they could punch and eat an ability for you, putting down Frost Bombs to then massively multiply your damage, and then just absolutely seeing a boss get chunked for 20 to 30% of its health all at once with a Cold Snap. It's a very hilarious playstyle, and I've been actually having a lot of fun with it, just because you'll basically be able to insta-freeze everything with Eye Winter as soon as you shoot 1 or 2 at it. It should keep you very safe and very comfortable as you finish up the axe and get yourself into endgame content. Like I said, this is not going to be our endgame setup. We are just simply basically using it as a vessel to carry us until we can properly swap to Archmage. But I do like the chilling and the freezing that this offers us on pretty much everything we come across. So I have a way to be able to take this and carry it over into an Archmage setup with Spark, which should feel just as good. I'm really excited to look into it and figure out how to put that together, as well as finally add in Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery into the build, and not only make us feel tanky because we're constantly seeing everything on the screen, but also just be able to take a hit to the face and for the most part, be able to shrug it off. This should pretty much be everything they need to know to be able to get this going. It's very simple and very to the point, and pretty much everyone that swapped with me yesterday on stream had a wonderful time clearing everything with it and had a really, really fun time just not having to deal with the overpowered monsters anymore. So if you haven't made the swap yet, I'd highly recommend to. And if you have any questions, you're more than free to either stop by my stream and ask me any of your questions there, or just write them in the comments below, and I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. With all that said, I hope you kitties have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you enjoy the swap over to cold, and I'll see you all in tomorrow's update.